Hello, everybody. I'm meteorologist Jeremy Wheeler, and it is time once again for WAVY Science Lab. And yeah, today we're going to do something that's a little more laid back. We're going to have some fun. We're going to take a look at some photos from the year from 2025. We're going to do a recap. Actually, that'd be a 2024 recap, isn't it? 2020. Or wait, yeah, 2025. Wow, time is flying. I was like, well, 2024. No, it's 2025. Time is flying. Okay, so we are going to do a recap, though. I apologize, and it's been a long day, but we're going to take a look back at a lot of the cool photos that we covered and a lot of the cool topics. So let's get right to it and talk about. We'll start off with the very first podcast that I did, which was about me in the Weather Center. No, it was about basically just kind of behind the scenes. And this was kind of a laid back one, but it was my first one, so I was a little nervous. But yeah, and so you can see just all the stuff in the background there. Those are the weather computers that we use. And we use a whole bunch of different computers every day. The one there on the left, that's actually how I run my show. I'm using it right now, actually. And so, you know, there's all kinds of stuff. There's one that runs mostly the web. There's one that we get information from the web. There's one that does the computers for the cameras. And then this is the green screen, and this is where I do my big weather segments. The smaller ones I do in front of a giant weather monitor, which we'll look at here in a moment. But there's some of the screens there that we're talking about. And then there's the microphone that I use. There's the giant monitor. So this is the one that I use for doing weather for the first and middle weathers, and then the green screen is the one I use for my big weather. So because that way I can kind of I don't know, take a little more time and focus on that instead of. But basically, it's just a different format. And then again, here's all the different computers in the Weather Center, the traffic computers over there, and we share the area with the traffic person in the morning. And we've got different tools that we use. We use tools like this. This is one of my maps that I made for today. And, you know, there was a lot of cold air in place and just a lot of mess coming in throughout the day. And so when I make these maps, I have to program the beginning and start point and make a movie out of it. So I had the cold front up there, the stationary front, the low, and you can kind of see everything, how it merges. So I make a start point, a stop point, and then it makes a movie out of it. Not like AI, not yet, but this is just a graphic that I use. So that's a little behind the scenes there. And then the second podcast that I did, we did it on temperature. And, you know, it was just basically, you know, how or cold things were to start. But then we went into just high detail. And people thought, oh, it's so simple. You know, I know what temperature is. Everybody knows what temperature is, right? Is this all going to be recap, or are you going to have something new? Well, we're gonna actually talk about all kinds of cool things in here. We probably won't have anything brand new except one element at the end. But yeah, the average kinetic energy of the particles system. So how fast those particles are moving around, you kind of get a snapshot at that moment of those particles. So what I did, this was the best part of this podcast. I think I even did it again down the road for heat. We did Frankie the Snowman, and this was temperature. And so then, you know, Frankie, I made this graphic. I spent about an hour and a half on this graphic. And so there it was. You put the snowman in there. That box none of that is real, of course. But I made all of it. And so I had to put those particles in and bounce it around. So then you add the heat, right? And Frankie, you know, that you increase the temperature. And Frankie, he unfortunately, he did melt through time and became a puddle as we heated it up. But then, you know, I mentioned that I have the power to reverse time using the time stone. And so then we brought Frankie back, and he was happy then after that point. So, you know, temperature, average kinetic energy of a system, how much energy there is in there. And then we talked about the history of it. And I'm not going to do that. But just, you know, basically, Galileo was often credited. You had just a lot of different scientists throughout time that developed these things. And you had the different scales too, right? You have Fahrenheit and Celsius on the thermometer. And so, you know, they each have their benefits there, developed at roughly about the same time, but a little bit different. And then we did the experiment, and this was pretty cool. We did the experiment outside where I had the two thermometers in the shade. They read about the same temperature. Wasn't exact, but they were close. And then I left one out in the sun for a while, about 5 minutes, and you saw that temperature go up. So it increased the average kinetic energy of the one on the right. The one on the left was in the shade, and it made a big difference. So, we tell people, hey, get in the shade if it's really hot out, summertime, which was when that podcast happened. And then we also have the different layers of the atmosphere. So that, how the temperature decreases in the troposphere, increases in the stratosphere, and then goes back down up again. But when you get up to the thermosphere, the temperature is high, but there's not a lot of particles, so there's not a lot of heat, which we'll get to in another podcast in a little bit. All right, then we went into pressure, and we talked about that. We talked about, the barometer, which measures the pressure, and old Greek word baros, weight, and meter meaning measure. So the barometers now, they're really fancy. These were the old ones developed by historians. So and there's barograph, I think was what that was, but it was barograph. So there was a way that you could actually measure the pressure over time. Back then it would go up and down and scribble a little bit. I think it was very slow moving. So then we have the way to think about it is that our air has pressure. We've got these columns of air over our heads, and so then it has some weight on them, and so that it has a pressure, that there's a weight that presses down on us, and so then more air equals more pressure, and you have areas of high and low pressure basically that look like this, and so you've got the different pressures throughout the atmosphere kind of coming and going, and then this was the example. We had the tire pressure in there, and I pumped up the tire, and yeah, that was back when it was warm, back in the day. Yeah, so that was pressure. And then here's, storm systems are areas of low pressure. You have rising air in those, and then sinking air on high pressure. And so we use the example of the hurricane, which we did another podcast about. So then we went into humidity and talked about that. And we're pretty familiar with humidity, but the beauty one was this, where we talked about how saturated air is. You have more moisture in that air up to a point. And so that was, we had 75% relative humidity. You have absolute humidity and then relative humidity. So the thing was, when you change the temperature, you can change that relative humidity, which is what we did. So now you have the same amount of moisture in there, but less holding capacity, or more holding capacity, I guess I should say. All right, we're going to come back in just a little bit and have more, so stand by. All right, we are back, and so we were just talking about relative humidity and how much moisture air can hold. And we talked a lot about that. We talked about, at the time of the podcast, fog and how that forms. And basically, you saturate the air, you cool things down to the dew point. Now your air is saturated. You have less holding capacity, and so liquid moisture forms, little droplets, and you get that. You get marine layer of fog to form there. That's an example, Golden Gate Bridge, and then you have the moisture decreases with height. So the temperature decreases up to a point. All right, so that was humidity. Then we talked about cooling down a home, and we talked about the history of the AC. So, we're not going to go too much into the histories of this, but the old days it was just ice blocks. And then, they went through time, and different scientists developed the modern AC unit. And, it takes a lot of energy to cool a home. I mean, 1,000 kilowatt hours per month, and it costs, hundreds of dollars sometimes in some cases to cool a home. So we talked about some of the tips to use, some of the things you can do: shut off your TV, use a fan. As you watch this, you will probably not have to use this because it is probably going to be quite chilly out. It's that time of year. I'm going to do a podcast next year of how to heat a home. The best way to do that. So we'll be talking more about that at some point. And, we talked about a home, how a lot of times those big bay windows let in the heat, the sun, and then you've got that insulation, that light. Light becomes heat, and so it adds to your home. So you got to put those curtains up. And then we talked a little bit about geothermal, things like that. We referred back to the experiment of, the sunlight. So that was cooling a home, and then we went and we expanded and talked about the hurricane, and that was a big one. That was a really cool topic, and we covered that quite extensively. We talked about hurricanes, how they're areas of low pressure, extreme areas of low pressure, and we talked about the structure. Very cool. This is from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They put out a lot of good graphics for us to use, and you can access these. Just pretty much just do a search for hurricane, and you can find it. And hopefully the AI doesn't get in the way of your search, but sometimes that happens. But you got cross section here of it, and we talked about the ingredients. We talked about all of the things a hurricane, and just covered it in detail, and saw some very cool imagery. Just some of the animations from our graphics company, some that we built, and then some from NOAA, just all that. And there's the Dvorak technique. And so that is for how they figure out, using satellites, the strength of the hurricane, using the shapes, looking down at the Earth. And this was developed, 1969 by Dr. Dvorak, and very cool there. We talked about storm surge. That's, a big problem around here. We get these hurricanes even offshore, and it'll create a storm surge. So this was one of those graphics that we have from our graphics company. And they did a great job with that. You can see that water level increasing. The water gets pushed up over and over, and you can get homes to flood out, and you can get a lot of problems there from that. And then we talked about Isabel a little bit. We had the wind damage from that. That was a big thing, 2004, just huge problems. That was outside our studio next door at the pavilion. The tent got blown off. There was a lot of flooding, and that was one of the most famous hurricanes around here. It's the benchmark, because also, the flooding was really bad. That was one of the worst floodings that we did have. Record high tide, 2003. I got here in 04, so I often mistake that. It was 03 is before I got here, the year before I got here. And then we talked a little about Isaias and some of the tornadoes. And so these are landfalling category 5s. And of course, then Melissa was category 5 and hit, Jamaica, but luckily that didn't come up this way. So that was a good podcast. That was really neat. We saw a lot of cool stuff in that podcast and talked about some good topics. So then we talked about the water cycle. And the water cycle, we kind of covered this a couple of times, but this was one of them coming up. And so the basics of it, there's evaporation, condensation, precipitation. I go around and do school talks. I haven't done as many as I used to, but I do, and I'll talk about the water cycle and how that's how our rain forms. That's how we get rain. That's how we get thunderstorms. And I'll kind of lead into thunderstorms at that point. Cool graphics here with the sun coming in, the electromagnetic spectrum, and sunlight comprised of all those different things there. And then the water molecules themselves. We talked about this with humidity. We talked about it a little bit when it came to the water cycle. Well, actually a lot. How it's got, that polar bond angle, and how it's a strong bond of the water molecules, the components of it. And this was pretty neat. Evaporation versus steam. So we talked about how, steam happens, evaporation happens below the boiling point, and evaporation is at the surface of the water. But boiling, you add enough energy, get that water temperature going up to about 212 Fahrenheit, and then next thing you know, you get boiling to happen. All the water molecules want to try and split up in there. So there's my chicken corn chowder that I made, and there was the boiling water, and those molecules in all that water is trying to change over at that point, and so you get that effect. And there was some steam fog. Let's see, we went back and talked a little bit about the relative humidity, and so we talked about that versus absolute humidity. Here was some different images of fog, and there's one really near fog after some rain. Oh, this was a neat graphic by our vendor, so pretty cool stuff. And then we talked a little bit about hail and ice. That also is part of the water cycle, and the different hail sizes. And so I may do a whole podcast about that at some point. I may do a whole podcast about hail down the road, maybe during severe weather season. I don't know. We'll figure that out. Talked a little bit about snow. I am going to do a podcast about snow. That'll be coming up fairly soon, actually in a couple weeks. So there's that. And the water cycle is very complicated actually. When you look at all the different pieces of it, all these are different pieces of it. You got evapotranspiration, you have aquifers, runoff, groundwater, all that stuff. So we did cover that a little bit as well. And then after that, we covered simple machines. We covered what they are, simple machines, the wedge, the incline plane. And so that was one of the wedges. And this was the best video that we had right there. Ooh, look at that. I love that. We're gonna run that one more time. So here we go, and back it up. There we go. And boom. So that was using the wedge. Meteorologist Jeremy Wheeler. Ah, very cool. Very cool. And so, and then here's the inclined plane. We had ramps. We had about levers and things like that. Okay, so we just covered a good amount of recap, saw some cool things. We're going to see some more. I got more podcasts to cover. Actually, not a lot of time to cover it. So we're going to have that coming up. Stay with us. All right, we are back, and it's time to talk more about some of the things we talked about so far in 2025, not 2024. And, we had a lot of cool topics. So this was another one. We talked about heat, not just temperature, but heat and how it's measured. It's measured with a thermometer, takes the reading of the average kinetic energy. But the thing is, the big thing was that it's the total amount of energy in the system. So you can take the snapshot and get your average, the thermometer, but then you want to see the total. So this is the way we look at body heat. This was an image, infrared image of a dog or an alien, I don't know. And then we had just lots of cool imagery on this one. Humans walking, you see the body heat from that. And then we went back and did I won't do it again, but we had the oven and talked about, we increased not just the average kinetic energy, but the total energy in that system. And so that caused the melting. And we talked about the electromagnetic spectrum, and there it is, infrared especially. And then the cool thing was we did that experiment where we had the heat and the specific heat. So we had, each of these objects has a different specific heat. If you put a certain amount of heat in, you get a certain amount of heat out. So you put in a lot into water, it takes a long time to heat it up. But like the sand, in air, that heats up right away, and so you get a lot of energy. And then we found out the results there of the experiment. And there's the graphics. So we said, well, certain things heated up more than others, and so it didn't take a lot of heat to put in to get out a lot of heat. And so that was very, very cool. I've done that experiment in colleges before. And so I did that one in my home. All right. Then we had a fun one. This one was pretty easy. This was an easy topic. We talked about trees and just all kinds of different trees. We went out to Paradise Creek Park and got some imagery from there in Portsmouth, and we appreciate it. And they labeled their trees, so that was a big help. And so we had all the different oaks and things like that. I had some kind of around me, the neighborhood, so lots of cool trees and all that. So that was a really good one, a very simple one. This one got a little more complicated. This one was the sun. So we talked about, the different imagery and just those sunspots there and solar flares, things like that. We talked about different layers of the sun, which was very cool. And, you had the photosphere, chromosphere, and we talked about how the corona is hotter than the surface of the sun, and very interesting because of, the temperatures are there pretty high, but there's not a lot of substance. But anyway, and then we talked about the sunspot cycle as well. So that was the sun. Very cool topic. We're probably going to be talking about the moon here in the next one. So in the next podcast coming up, we talked about lightning. Very cool stuff. We had all kinds of different imagery for that. And so we had multiple lightning strikes and how lightning forms. That was a fun one. That was a really cool one. We had just such good imagery from local and then from NOAA as well. And they provide us with some great stuff there that it's educational for all the kids and all the families. And so lightning, that was a really good one to do, and lightning safety as well. We talked about tides then and tidal flooding. We had the imagery of the different tide stations, and there was an old tide station. We talked about the Bay of Fundy and how those tides just get crazy, and the tides just come in and the water level is something like 30 or 40 feet, something crazy. It's one of the biggest tide departures in the world. And we talked about how that, the tides affect us. Then we had another simple topic. We talked about paper. Yep. Ooh, paper. It became pretty cool. I mean, we talked about how paper was made. And, we had the video from Franklin. I don't have that right now, but the paper mill out in Franklin, it talked about that and how it comes from trees. So that was a pretty fun one. Then we talked about dams. And Hoover Dam was one of the best examples there. And so, one of the biggest dams in the world. I think, did I say one of the first dams built? Not the first, but one of the first industrial dams built. Definitely not one of the first ones. That was thousands of years ago. So, but yeah, there's structures. And there's the Three Gorges Dam in China. I think that one is the biggest one in the world. And then we also talked about the structures of dams and the different types. So that was neat. We have a local dam around here that I visited, and that was Burnt Mills in Suffolk. Very cool to see that. And so I got some video from that. And then we did travel hazards just recently. Talked about the different travel hazards that people can be impacted by. A dam break, maybe one of them, but we talked about how there's urban and rural flooding is a little bit different, and we talked about flooding safety when it comes to cars. Flooding at night, things like that. And we just had a lot of cool topics in there, and flood risk levels. Now this impacts us going forward. I mean, this is something that impacts us all the time around here. And so then we talked about all those different travel hazards. Pardon me. We talked about ice as well, traveling in the snow and ice, and how you got to just be careful and of course take your time. Don't brake really fast. It says do not brake. You have to brake at some point. Don't brake hard and then turn into the slide if your car slides. And we talked about hazards like that. And then we talked about cleaning and cleaning products. That was really cool. I learned a lot in that one, how to make soap or how they make soap. And it was very complicated. It actually, there was a lot to it that went into it. And I didn't know that, and it was so cool to learn some of that stuff. We had the grease there, the grease example, and the detergent. And so we had the sort of experiment where I had the grease from my wife's pot roast. And this was the crock pot. And so I put in a couple of drops, and of course, it just ate away at the grease. That's what it does. It breaks it down. And washed my wife's car, which, wow, that was a big experiment, wasn't it? And got that clean in the end. Talked about bleach, talked about how that forms, and mold and those types of things. And then finally, we talked about clouds, and that was one of the more recent ones. That's one where we really got into it and talked about the different cloud types, cumulus, altocumulus, cirrus, and all those. And so that was one of the most recent ones that we did. And then, we did the environmental tips of the day. So, I try and put those in and just try and give people reminders as to, how to try and, save the planet. I mean, especially we use so many things out there. Try and reduce, reuse, recycle. It's a mantra, and you really need to, because there's just, we can't. It's not finite. It's not infinite. Pardon me. The amount of space we have on this planet. So, all right. So that's it for today. Recap. We're going to have a lot of new podcasts. The next one probably the moon, and so we'll talk more about that and in an upcoming podcast. All right. Everybody have a good day, and hey, WAVY Science Lab. Stay tuned.